The air inside the upscale cafe in downtown Paris was thick with hushed whispers and the clinking of coffee cups. The place was alive with intellectual chatter, political debates, football discussions, and the latest headlines. But none of that compared to what was about to unfold. Sadio Main, dressed in his usual humble attire, had just settled into a quiet corner, enjoying a cup of mint tea. He wasn't one for extravagant displays, despite his fame and wealth. A few patrons recognized him but respected his space. Then came Julian Marchand, a self-proclaimed truth-teller in the world of European sports journalism. He was known for his sharp tongue, biting critiques, and, more often than not, his disdain for players who didn't fit the European footballer stereotype. Especially African players, he strutted into the cafe with an arrogant smirk, his expensive designer coat slung over his shoulders like a cape. The moment he spotted Maine, his eyes gleamed with mischief. With exaggerated steps, he sauntered over, making sure everyone was watching. "Ah, the great Sadio Maine," Julian said, loud enough for the entire cafe to hear. "Tell me, how does it feel to be a millionaire who still acts like a peasant?" Silence. Conversations halted. Eyes darted toward Maine, waiting for his reaction. Maine looked up, his expression unreadable. He took a slow sip of his tea, unfazed. Julian chuckled and continued. "I mean, come on. You give away your money. You dress like a commoner, and you don't even own a Ferrari? What's the point of making millions if you're going to live like a villager?" A few nervous laughs rippled through the cafe, but most people looked uncomfortable. They knew Julian thrived on controversy, but this felt like an attack. For a moment, Maine remained silent. Then, he placed his cup down gently and met Julian's gaze. His next words would leave everyone speechless. The tension in the cafe was palpable. Eyes flicked between Sadio Maine and Julian Marchand, as if watching a high-stakes poker game. But Maine didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled, a small, knowing smile. Then in a calm voice, he said, "Tell me, Julian, what makes a man rich?" Julian scoffed, leaning back in his chair like he had already won. "Wealth, obviously. Luxury. Power." Maine tilted his head, his smile never faltering. "Is that so? Then why do I feel richer than you?" The cafe went dead silent. Julian blinked. For the first time, he wasn't in control of the conversation. "You what?" he stammered. Maine leaned forward slightly, his tone warm but sharp. "You measure wealth by what a man has. I measure it by what a man gives. And by that standard, I am the wealthiest man in this room." Julian's smirk twitched. He tried to come up with a comeback, but the crowd was already murmuring. People exchanged glances, some even nodding in agreement. Maine didn't stop there. He continued, "A man who gives back to his people, who lifts others up instead of looking down on them. That's true wealth." Julian's confidence wavered. His usual charm and wit gone. He had underestimated Maine. Then, Maine said something that completely shattered him. Julian's jaw clenched. He wasn't used to being outplayed, especially not in public. He needed to regain control. "Oh, please," he scoffed. "That's just an excuse for mediocrity. You're in the elite world of football, Maine. Act like it. You can't change the world by handing out a few dollars." Maine chuckled, shaking his head. "Is that what you think?" Julian shrugged. "It's the truth." Maine leaned in, lowering his voice just enough that people had to strain to hear him. "Then let me tell you a truth of my own." He took a slow breath, then said, "Do you know what I do with my money, Julian?" Julian opened his mouth, but Maine didn't let him answer. "I build schools. I build hospitals. I give my people opportunities they never had. While you write articles. You talk. You criticize. But you do nothing. And that's the difference between us. A wave of whispers swept through the cafe. People murmured in agreement, some even nodding. Julian's face turned red, but Maine wasn't done. He picked up his tea again, took a sip, and said, "So tell me, between us, who's really living like a peasant?" Julian's confidence shattered. For the first time, he had nothing to say. The cafe remained silent. The battle had been fought, and Sadio Maine had won. Julian Marchand's face burned with humiliation. His carefully crafted persona, the fearless journalist, the man who never lost a debate, was unraveling before everyone's eyes. And Maine wasn't even trying. The nervous chuckle escaped Julian's lips as he tried to regain control. "Oh, how noble of you, Maine. The humble millionaire, the saint of football. But let's be honest here. Do you really think your charity makes a difference? Africa is still drowning in poverty. Your money is just a drop in an ocean of corruption." The words hung in the air. The cafe gasped. He had crossed the line. Maine's face remained calm, but his eyes darkened. There was no anger, just a deep, quiet intensity that made Julian shift uncomfortably. "Tell me, Julian," Maine said slowly, "have you ever built something? Anything?" Julian hesitated. "That's not the point." "No." Maine tilted his head. "Because I have. I've built schools. I've built hospitals. I built hope. And you." He let the silence do the work. Julian swallowed hard, his bravado crumbling. He could feel the weight of the stairs around him. "You mock what you don't understand," Maine continued, his voice steady. "Because deep down, you know you've never made a difference." Julian's fists clenched. He was losing control, and he knew it. He needed to hit back. And then he smirked. A desperate, reckless smirk. "If you care so much about giving back, Maine, why don't you go back?" The cafe fell into absolute silence. People froze. No one dared to move. The racist undertone was deafening. All eyes were on Maine. How would he respond? The weight of Julian's words crashed into the cafe like a thunderclap. Why don't you go back? A loaded phrase. Poisonous. Insult wrapped in faux curiosity. The room froze. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the sound of coffee being poured seemed to hesitate. Julian Marchand had played his final, desperate card. And everyone knew it. Sadio Maine didn't react right away. Instead, he simply stared at Julian, his deep brown eyes unwavering. Not in anger, not in shock, but in something far more dangerous, disappointment. Then he spoke. Calmly, sharply, lethally. "Go back where, Julian?" Julian hesitated. He hadn't expected Maine to call him out so directly. He expected outrage, an outburst, something he could twist later. Maine leaned forward slightly. His voice was softer now, but each word was razor sharp. "To my home? The place where I built schools? Where children who had no future now have one? Where hospitals now treat the sick? Is that what you mean?" Julian shifted in his seat, suddenly uncomfortable. He had tried to be clever, but Maine had turned his words into a noose around his own neck. The cafe's air grew thicker. A few people exchanged knowing glances. Some looked at Julian with outright disgust. Others, those who had remained neutral, now made up their minds. Maine wasn't done. Or perhaps it means something else. Something uglier. Julian swallowed hard. "Tell me, Julian, where would you go back to?" The cafe exploded in hushed gasps. Julian's face drained of color. For the first time in his life, Julian Marchand had no words. And that silence was the loudest thing in the room. Julian Marchand sat frozen, his usual smug confidence nowhere to be found. The cafe wasn't just watching anymore. They were judging. Sadio Main's words hung in the air like a guillotine, sharp and irreversible. "Tell me, Julian, Where would you go back to? A slow, creeping tension spread across the room. Eyes flicked toward Julian, waiting, anticipating that he licked his lips, buying time. He needed a comeback, something, anything to regain control. That's not, he cleared his throat. That's not the same thing. Maine simply smiled. Isn't it? Julian blinked rapidly, his brain racing for an escape. But there wasn't one. He had walked into his own trap. Then a voice from the back of the cafe cut through the silence. He's right. A woman, mid-40s, sharp features, an elegant scarf wrapped around her neck, leaned forward at her table. Her eyes locked onto Julian with an expression of quiet contempt. You asked him why he doesn't go back. But what about you, Marchand? Where's your back? A few people nodded. A man in a suit murmured, Exactly. Julian felt the shift. The room wasn't just against him. They were turning on him. Maine, still calm, picked up his tea and took a slow sip before speaking again. You see, Julian, people like you think wealth is power. You think controlling a narrative makes you untouchable. But here's the truth. He set his cup down, eyes locked onto Julian. The world is changing. And men like you, you're being left behind. The words landed like a punch to the gut. Julian knew it was true. He could feel his carefully built reputation crumbling. Right here, in this cafe, in front of people who used to respect him. And for the first time in his life, Julian Marchand was truly afraid. Julian Marchand's mind was spiraling. He had come into this cafe expecting an easy win, a moment to mock Sadio Maine in public and solidify his reputation as the sharp-tongued journalist who never backed down. Instead, he was the one on trial. The room had turned against him. The murmurs of agreement, the knowing glances, the disdainful looks, they weren't directed at Maine anymore. They were all focused on him that he had to fight back. Julian straightened his posture, forcing out a smirk. Fake confidence. Oh, come on. Now I'm a villain? Because I asked a simple question. Silence. No one was buying it. Maine, still calm, still composed, tilted his head slightly. It wasn't a question, Julian. It was a statement disguised as one. Julian scoffed. You're twisting my words. Am I? Maine asked, his voice steady, unwavering. The tension was unbearable that a voice from the corner of the room, an older man in a tailored suit, someone who clearly recognized Julian, spoke up. No, you're just not used to being challenged. Julian's heart skipped a beat. He turned sharply toward the man, but before he could speak, enough. It was Maine that he didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence alone commanded the room. I have no interest in destroying you, Julian. Julian felt his stomach twist. That was worse than an insult. It was pity. I just want you to understand one thing. Maine leaned in, his voice low but deadly serious. You don't have to tear others down to be seen. Julian's chest tightened. He wanted to argue. He wanted to lash out. But the words wouldn't come, because for the first time in his life, Julian Marchand had nothing left to say. Julian Marchand sat there, his breath shallow, his mind racing. The cafe had turned into a courtroom, and he was the accused, and no cameras. No editorial control. Just him and the truth. And the truth? It was suffocating. His reputation, his career, built on controversy, sharp words, and tearing people down. But now, stripped of his platform, stripped of his ability to twist the story in his favor, he was powerless. Sadio Maine? He hadn't raised his voice once. He hadn't insulted him. And yet, he had destroyed him. Julian's fingers clenched into fists beneath the table. He needed to escape. With a forced chuckle, he pushed back his chair. Well, he muttered, voice tight, this has been fun. He stood up abruptly. The legs of the chair scraped against the floor. An ugly sound in the thick silence. N01 stopped him. N01 said a word. He turned toward the door, forcing himself to walk slow, as if he were leaving on his own terms. But he wasn't. He was running to S's hand touched the door handle. Main S voice stopped him. Julian. Julian froze, that he didn't want to turn around. But something in Main S tone, calm, unshaken, final, forced him to. Main studied him for a moment, then said, I hope one day you understand. The words weren't meant to humiliate. They were an offering, but Julian wasn't ready to take it. With a clenched jaw, he yanked the door open and stepped out into the cold Parisian AI, or as it slammed shut behind him. He knew that he hadn't just lost the argument. He had lost something much bigger. The door slammed shut behind Julian Marchand, but the weight of the moment followed him. He stormed down the narrow Parisian street, heart pounding, hands trembling. His mind was in chaos, replaying the conversation over and over, searching for a way to twist it, to rewrite it in his favor. But he couldn't, because for the first time in his life, he wasn't the one controlling the narrative. Inside the cafe, the atmosphere shifted. The tension dissipated, leaving behind something heavier, understanding that a businessman near the counter leaned toward his colleague. Did you see that? He had nothing. A young woman, a student perhaps, shook her head. I used to respect him. Thought he was just brutally honest. But now, he just looked small. Maine simply took another sip of his tea, unbothered, unchanged. Someone hesitated before speaking. Why didn't you humiliate him? Maine set his cup down and smiled. Not out of victory, but something deeper, because men like him don't need to be humiliated. They need to be shown who they really are. And Julian? He had seen it. For the first time, he had looked into a mirror and not liked what stared back. And as he walked, each step heavier than the last, he wondered, was this the moment everything changed, or would he run from the truth again? Julian Marchand walked aimlessly through the cold Parisian streets. His mind was a battlefield, torn between anger, humiliation, and something far worse, self-doubt. This wasn't how it was supposed to go that he was Julian Marchand, the journalist who dictated the conversation, who exposed weaknesses, never showed his own. Yet here he was, exposed, stripped down to the core. And the worst part? Maine hadn't even tried to destroy him. That's what haunted him the most. He had been offered grace. The words replayed in his head, each syllable cutting deeper. I hope one day you understand. Julian let out a shaky breath. Why had that hit him so hard? His whole career had been built on tearing people apart, breaking them down in print, in interviews, in debates. He thrived on conflict. But now, for the first time, he wasn't sure he had won anything that he stopped walking, staring at his own reflection in a darkened shop window. Who was he without the mockery? Without the controversy? The answer? He didn't know, and that terrified him. With a deep breath, he pulled out his phone. His fingers hovered over Twitter, instinctively ready to craft a response, to twist the narrative, to regain control. But then, he hesitated. For the first time, he had nothing to say. Instead, he locked his phone and slipped it back into his pocket. And as he stood there, alone in the quiet Parisian night, Julian Marchand finally understood. He hadn't silenced Sadio Maine. Sadio Maine had silenced him.